Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our session A1 in your schedule. My name is Mario Nunez. I'm a program officer at the Office of State Support, which is part of the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education of the U.S. Department of Education. And we really thank you for you being here today and to share with us and your expert panel on the topic which is to be discussed. In this case, we're going to be looking at specifically at the critical elements from the guide that are elements 2.3, 2.5, 2.6, and 4.7. The element 2.3 starts on page 40 of the guide if you want to just like know exactly where we are. And it continues and then it sort of jumps on 4.7 almost at the end of the guide. So what is it that we're going to talk about other than the critical elements? No, well, we're just going to talk about the critical elements. Basically, on the panel, the discussion will focus primarily on the critical elements that which I described and what is the state responsibility under the peer review framework. The panelists will discuss various aspects of evidence needed for test administration, test data security, and training and maintenance of a state assessment, which we all agree that there are very important issues in the test administration. Panelists who have served as recent peer reviewers, like we have here, will offer observations on what types of evidence demonstrates a state's adherence to these critical elements. So basically, they're going to talk a little bit about each of those critical elements, and they're going to give you very concrete examples on what they feel is appropriate evidence to support those critical elements. Okay? So who do we have in the panel? Well, it is a very distinguished panel. First here to my left, and I'm sorry because I'm a lefty, so I get confused in the left and the right all the time, but it's to my left, is Heather Peltier. Or Peltier?
Peltier.
Peltier, you know, I was trying to say it the French way.
You got
it. Heather has been a panelist with us several times. And Heather has served over the past 17 years in a variety of roles in public education, including a teacher, literary coach, psychometrician, senior director of assessment, and her current role is the chief assessment officer for the Tennessee Department of Education. So we have a state panelist here. She has also served as the chair of the Central Florida Assessment Collaborative. I come from Florida. I used to live in Miami.
Oh.
I just didn't know that. As well as the secretary of the Florida Educational Research Association. Heather received her undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia, a master's degree from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and an ed special degree from Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. She also got her PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of South Florida. So please welcome Heather Peltier. Hello. Oh, thank you. She brought me water. She brought me gifts. I appreciate that. All right. This is Janet, a friend of mine. All right. So then we have John Olson. And John also has had a lot of experience working with us in terms of being a peer reviewer. John is the president of Olson Educational Measurement and Assessment Services and a senior partner of the Assessment Solutions Group. He has more than 30 years of experience providing consulting on a variety of measurement and statistical issues for international, national, state, and local assessment programs. Over the past 2 decades, Dr. Olson has directed a variety of research and development projects and has overseen the creation of a wide range of products and resources for assessment professionals. Dr. Olson has also served as an independent consultant for a variety of statistical, measurement, and assessment issues for the nation, states, and school districts. He has served as several state TACs, and he has also published numerous articles on assessment programs in NAEP, TIMSS, SCAS projects, and technical psychometric research. Dr. Olson is knowledgeable of ESEA and its later iteration ESSA as of 2015, and he has helped several state plans for peer review. He has recently served as a state assessment peer reviewer for the U.S. Department of Education. So welcome, Dr. Olson. And last but not least, actually, I'm the last because I'm the beginning. We have June. June Sack is also an experienced peer reviewer. June is currently the Vice President of Content Special Projects at AAR, the American Institutes of Research. Ms. Sack has led the test development as a Vice President of Content and Test Development for AAR assessments for the past 18 years. Okay? I don't have that kind of experience. Developing more than 10,000 items annually, AAR test development teams develop and align items to the Common Core state standards, the Next Generation Science standards, as well as the numerous state standards. SAC was primarily responsible for the development of items and the assembly of the test forms for all of AAR assessment projects. And before joining AAR, Ms. SAC worked at ETS, Educational Testing Service, for 12 years, managing verbal test development for numerous projects, including the GRE, GMAT, the LSAT, the SAT, NAAP, I feel like Campbell Soup Company, and practice assessments. Ms. Sachs holds an MA in Educational Psychology from New York University. I'm a graduate from NYU, by the way. Just something to relate to. So welcome, June. And now I am going to pass the microphone first to Heather, and she's going to start telling us a little bit about the topic.
Right. Thank you very much.
Are you close to you, or
yeah, maybe
let's move around?
I'm a little short.
Thank
you. Right. I'm also a little bit nervous. This is my first ever panel, so I'm very excited to be here. Thank you all for being my first ever panel audience. I'm going to even closer? Okay. Okay, yeah.
I think you're going to sing.
Is that better? Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about critical element 2.3, which is a test administration. And essentially, I'm going to break down my talking points into 3 topics. So the first will be kind of general points about this critical element. The next is going to be talking a little bit about communications and some of the things that we might hope to see in a submission in terms of communication strategies. And then the third is going to be technology-specific issues. So I'm going to go over each one of those. And as Mario said, my background is I have been a peer reviewer for a few rounds now, and I'm now a state person as well. So I did my actual first submission from a state this past December. And we received our peer notes initially. So it's been really exciting to get to see it from both angles. All right, so first of all, kind of generally, in terms of this critical element, one of the things that reviewers are looking for is very clear guidance in the manuals and in documentation for a variety of situations. So the manuals need to cover things like security, any testing irregularities, any special circumstances, like if a student is caught cheating, or maybe a test administrator or something like that. Procedural guidance, policy guidance in terms of who actually takes the test. Again, including any special situations, like what if there were homebound students, or any other circumstances that might be specific to this administration. One of the things that's really helpful to have included in the manuals is checklists, those before, during, and after checklists. And it's especially specific, it's especially helpful if they're specific to the role. So for example, if there are before, during, and after checklists for testing coordinators versus the test administrators, because those are going to look very different. Or even if there's, if it's a technology specific one, if there are checklists for maybe your technology director or the tech administrators on site. So any evidence that you have that you're giving just very clear, specific guidance, straightforward guidance to all of the different roles that are going to be involved in making the test administration successful. Guidance on handling materials, including maybe any return procedures if it's a paper-based assessment. And then guidance on the testing environment, including I know as a state person, one of the biggest questions that we get, and we get all the time, is the testing environment in terms of what can be on the teacher's walls, what can be displayed, do they have to cover it, take it down, how specific can you get for them without being too specific, because obviously each classroom is very different. So striking that balance, but at least evidence that you've been giving your teachers some sort of guidance, and hopefully it's clear and interpretable in terms of the testing environment, electronic devices, things like that. Other things for administration that we look for are evidence of scripts for administration, so that there's a clear, and I think a lot of these are pretty standard, I believe, that most submissions I've seen have most, if not all, of the things that I'm mentioning. And then guidance for selecting and administering accommodations. And again, that is really, that's really helpful to have if that's clear for the users. And also, if there are any differences in terms of the accommodations that might be offered for a computer-based assessment versus paper-based, if there's some sort of guidance there that school users can use. All right. The next, I had a long list. I'm going to try to get through it all in 10 minutes, and I hope I'm not talking too fast. The next,
More or less.
More or less. Okay, yes, 10 minutes. Communications is the next thing I was going to talk about. So evidence of communications in the submission. So one of the biggest challenges here with administration is that requirement that ensuring that all individuals responsible for test administration receive training. And that's a really difficult thing to do as a state, making sure, because at a certain point, your districts have autonomy, obviously, and so you don't have that control all the way down to the end user, to the teacher that's actually going to be administering. So I've seen some variance in terms of the submissions. Some of the things I've seen where the state will say, well, we give a training to the districts, and then it's on them to ensure that the others do training. One of the things that's really helpful, though, is so that's that top-down approach, right? And it may not be sufficient, because what we find sometimes is the training that gets delivered to the district test coordinator doesn't always filter down to the building test coordinator. Or if the building test coordinator gets it, it may not filter down to the teachers who are serving as test administrators or proctors. Or sometimes if they're using volunteer community members, they're coming in to proctor the test, to be there with the administrator. So just making sure that everyone is trained appropriately is really a challenge. One of the things that we have recently begun implementing in Tennessee that had not been done in the past, that I think is really an important element of this, is it was not sufficient to just say, well, we've offered a training, and the districts had the opportunity to attend. And so we begun, this seems really elementary, but we begun tracking non-participation. Who didn't attend the training? And then making sure that we follow up so that we ensure that at least there's one district person at every single district that got the training. And sometimes there are special circumstances, like maybe charter districts, or maybe you've got private schools that are administering. So just really keeping track and monitoring that everyone is actually getting the appropriate training. The other big challenge that I think as a state person that we have, and at least in Tennessee, and I'm sure this is probably the case for many of your states as well, is turnover for your district testing coordinators. So you have new district testing coordinators. In Tennessee this year, we have between 60 and 70 brand new district testing coordinators. So we've got to start really from the ground up and build in that structure and those supports to make sure they're able to adequately deliver successful test administration. So some of the things that we as a state have been working on and providing are things like even simple things like seating charts. Make sure your students are in seating charts. Or because of the nature of the testing platform that we use, it's very important if connectivity fails and the student work is not appearing, they have to go through a cache recovery process. It's really important to know specifically which computer that student tested on. So again, providing that, just kind of simple organizers to district testing coordinators. Here's a sample plan that you could use. It's a seating plan. It also has the computer ID attached to the student, because you're going to need that if something goes wrong. Because it's things that they don't know or could anticipate necessarily being brand new. So giving them really that structure and support. Things like acknowledgement of training forms that they can have all their building test coordinators and test administrators sign. Another thing that we have been working on is developing some out-of-the-box trainings for building test coordinators and for test administrators. Because in the past, what was done is the state would deliver a test to the district deliver training to the district testing coordinators, and say, now go forth and do. And each district testing coordinator then had to go take that training and modify it for their building so that they only had school appropriate information. Then each building testing coordinator had to modify it for their teachers so they only had the administrator appropriate information. So we're working to actually, as a state, deliver materials that they can use just out of the box for training those different stakeholders. Things like, for paper-based, I'm jumping a little bit. I am going through my checklist of points. Chain of custody forms for paper-based testing. And then guidance to the new district testing coordinators for how to collect and store this various documentation I described above. The other really important piece we've been working on is modes of communication. And this became very, very, very important to us this past spring when we had some challenges with our testing. And we even had a disaster one day where a dump truck actually crashed through, I guess, an internet cable and severed connectivity in 12 districts. So we had some challenges. So communication was really key. So we do in-person trainings. We have it's called the Road Show. We travel around the state to do in-person. We also offer monthly webinars for district testing coordinators. And during the testing window, we were actually having daily webinars every afternoon. It was completely optional. They could sign in and just get the information. We have our website, a listserv that we email out to them. One of the new things that I've implemented since I've been there is text message alert system. So if something did go wrong, they could instantly get a text message. And we allow district and building, I'm talking way too slow, building test coordinators to opt in. We also had an open call-in line during the testing window so that the technology directors could dial in and could communicate with each other, and we had someone from the vendor on the line as well as someone from the state. And then I'm going to talk real quickly about tech-specific issues. One of the challenges is balancing that schedule of testing versus item exposure. Online or computer-based testing requires generally a longer window unless all of your districts have a one-to-one solution. So with that, there's always the hazard of the item exposure. So that's something to consider in the submission here. For preparation for this, we had a certification process for districts. I think this is pretty standard. They have to go through and look at their hardware. They have to look at their bandwidth and make sure this is right. And then we've also, because we have so many new coordinators, we have documentation of some hands-on platform training that we did for them. We've got tactical operations centers throughout the state where we could actually have someone respond and be in a district within, I think it's 90 minutes is the maximum. And then one of the weaknesses that I've seen in quite a few submissions and that we are struggling with as well as a state is that contingency plan. Hey, a true contingency plan. What do you really do when everything fails? So that you don't have that inconsistent reaction that we saw in our districts where some districts said, 5 minutes, internet's down, we're calling it. And then others, have the kids sitting in labs for 3 hours and everyone's really angry. So trying to maybe set some more standardized guidelines in that contingency plan, and I think that's one of the challenges that we've seen. Sorry, I think I'm at my time, right?
You're right on time.
Okay,
Maybe
thank
like
you.
1 more minute. I just want to.
Okay.
I gave you a
Okay.
warning
Well,
before it was the 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, then I'll say one last thing if I have 1 more minute, because I have one more thing on my list. One of the things that's really helpful also to have in the submission is a quickly access kind of list of problems, a troubleshooting guide. What do you do? Because that was, again, one of the lessons learned that we had, was we had a troubleshooting guide, but it wasn't easily accessible for test administrators. And when there was a loss of connectivity, what was supposed to happen, we had given directions so the district testing coordinators, the students should keep testing because their responses will be cached on the local device. That didn't happen. People panicked. They weren't sure what to do. They sent the kids back, and now we had a large situation where we had students that had been exposed to that test, and a day has passed because they were sent back to class and they couldn't find the kids, bring them back that afternoon to test. So really having things that are easy and accessible for people so that everyone is on the same page when troubles do arise is really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Heather, thank you so much. Just two things that I want to add that I failed to say at the beginning, which I think is going to be helpful for the logistics of the session. First of all, you have the manual, so you have the actual critical elements right in front of you. So I didn't read the complete, a critical element because you can read it yourselves. I mean, I don't want to insult your intelligence. And also it gives more time for the panelists, and then also more time for questions. And we ask you to entertain your questions at the end when the panelists are finished. So I would suggest that you write them down on all your folders. Inside your folders, there's like this cards that you may use to take notes, or you can take notes with your own, materials. And then if there are questions that the panelists, because maybe they deal with topics that or issues that the panelists, are not necessarily having to be able to answer, you can give us those questions and we'll forward them to Donna and to Deborah, and then we'll respond to those questions at a later time. So I just wanted to say that we're going to have a whole session, about 20 minutes, even more, depending on how we manage the time here at the presentation side, for you guys to ask questions and get responses from the panelists. So I ask you to hold your questions until that time. So I appreciate that, and I'm sure they'll appreciate that as well. So thank you so much, Heather. That was a very good explanation. And now we're going to go to John, and John is going to let us know about element 2.5. And by the way, all panelists are also addressing in their response also element 4.7, which is technical analysis and ongoing maintenance. So they're going to give you a little bit of that because it's sort of like it's an all-encompassing type of critical element that applies to all the elements that they're addressing. So, all right, John, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. I'm ready. Just set the timer here.
Yes.
So what I would like to do is provide some examples of good evidence for test security and peer review, as well as some bad examples that I've seen.
Can you get a little closer to the microphone?
Can you hear me better? Is this one on? It's
Maybe.
dead.
Oh, okay. Well, you can use mine. We'll just
Okay.
pass it along.
I can talk real loud and it won't get any more volume. Okay, is that better? So, okay, let's restart the timer here. But let me tell you one reason why I'm discussing this topic. You know that test security is a relatively new requirement in peer review, and I'm very glad that the U.S. Department of Ed added it to peer review. So it's been always a question, okay, now what is it that states are going to submit in regard to it? But I have some background in this, in that about 5-6 years ago, did a study, an actual research project with the CCSSO TILSA SCAS on developing a test security guidebook for states. Now, this was before this topic became part of peer review. It was just states were saying they needed a little more guidance on things. And so that turned into a second book, and a lot of the information that came out of those reports from TILSA actually became integrated into peer review requirements. So that said, I just wanted to give you some background. So what I've seen, probably the number one best example that states can provide on good evidence for test security is a test security handbook, something that's comprehensive, has been put together on the topic, and integrates basically everything relevant to test security, policies, procedures, practices, all into the document. And oftentimes it's organized in a way that the TILSA reports, as well as peer review, say is a good framework. Focus on prevention, detection, remediation, investigation, those 4 areas, and provide documentation of what the state's doing in those areas. Not every state has one, though. In fact, I haven't seen that many, except for some that I've helped states and worked on or reviewed. So typically what a state is putting together as their evidence is a hopefully organized collection of documents on their state policies and procedures related to test security. And I'm saying hopefully organized because sometimes the organized part of it isn't so much. some of the pieces of evidence, if you're just compiling things from the State Department, summaries of reports, if reports or some sort of documents have been prepared on state test security practices, expectations of what goes on in districts and schools. Certainly, if you've had a test security audit, which I highly recommend, then that summary of that should be provided, showing that the state is addressing things, as well as hopefully making improvements to the system. Evidence of monitoring. I know that monitoring is in another peer review requirement topic, but it's good to have it in section 2.5 too. Certainly any evidence the state has on preventing irregularities, although when I was writing up my thoughts here, I thought, well, prevention is a great goal, but it's almost impossible to prevent all irregularities. I mean, that's just a fact of the real world. So minimizing irregularities is a good thing, and the steps taken toward that. So any irregularities hopefully are fairly minor and don't jeopardize the entire assessment that's being given. Certainly, test administration manuals and test coordinator manuals should have information in them on test security, and that can be provided as evidence for peer review. The focus there would be on those procedures that the state requires that the schools and districts follow before, during, and after test administration. So a lot of the things Heather was saying, I'm listening going, test security pops up a lot, and it should. Documentation of procedures to maintain security of test materials at every step of the process. Now, in paper and pencil testing, obviously there's all that shipping, receiving, and where are the tests stored. With online assessments, it's a little different, but there's still security issues, especially once the test is being given in the schools. One key thing that I don't always see and might be in passing is preventing illicit use of technology or devices. This has become more and more widespread, and I don't think a year goes by without hearing something going on, and kids are taking pictures of the test and putting them somewhere. So states need to show that they're trying their best in that area to prevent that from happening. So maybe it's another impossible task to do completely, but certainly you got to take steps toward it and show that you are taking those steps. Training materials are extremely important throughout. Certainly, as Heather was talking about on test administration, but specifically on test security. In fact, one of the better things is if the state has a specific training session just on test security that they require district coordinators and school and test administrators to all take that training ahead of time. And let me add to that, because Heather said it too, and I can't emphasize this enough. You have to have evidence that everybody was trained. I went into a district one time and we were doing, I wouldn't call investigation, but we were collecting data on what went on because something improper went on. And I asked the test administrator, well, were you trained? And she looked at me and said, I don't know. I said, isn't that part of the process? She goes, I don't remember. So then I asked the leadership in the district, and they didn't have any documentation, so who knows? I was astounded, okay. Well, need evidence there. So states need to submit documentation on secure use of test accommodations, on policies, on consequences. If improprieties are found, those should be in writing, and they should be published, basically. And then variously an assortment of communications from the state education agency to the districts on their test security policies. Some states communicate a lot on this topic, others it's you got to kind of look around if it even exists. So most of that was on prevention. In the detection area, certainly would like to see evidence that the state has implemented some sort of formal analytical procedures for detection, such as data forensics, web monitoring, other things that can analyze data and look at things. And when I say data forensics, had this conversation with states too many times. They say, oh, we do erasure analysis, and say, well, that's not sufficient. That's a start. And it's becoming less and less relevant now with online assessment taking over. What would be good to see is a more comprehensive plan for data forensics, looking at unusual score gains, response changes, similarity analysis, pattern analysis, person fit analysis, and timing, looking at how long it's taking kids to respond to questions. All those things should be doable. I'm not saying a state has to do every single one of them, but it should be doing some of those and thinking about others and documenting it. All right, procedures for reporting irregularities and incidents, such as a security incident response plan that was recommended in the TILSA report. That's definitely a good thing to have and submit for evidence. Procedures for remediation of incidents, if they are found, and procedures for doing investigations of incidents. These should all be spelled out and in the state's plans, either in their test security handbook or somewhere along the line, documentation that's front and center, because it's quite possible an investigation may be needed sometime. And so documentation would look at things like the evidence required that you want to have preserved, various rules for dealing with things, strategies and guidelines, and respecting student privacy throughout the entire process. And then one more thing, good evidence would include state policies and procedures that apply to all assessment components. I know the focus has been on general ed mostly, but now certainly alternate, and now the ELP and alt ELP, all that has to be in there, and these procedures and policies need to apply to all parts, and there may be new things that have to be addressed as you're thinking about these other assessments. And also procedures and the evidence needs to be applied to testing mode, so paper and pencil or online, and there are some different aspects of test security that needs to be addressed when you move to online. And if you're doing both, you need to spell that out. So how's my time here?
You're doing fine.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
All right, one more thing then. Bad examples. You want to hear bad examples, right? Please don't do this. Submit a haphazard collection of materials that look like they were just all thrown together, a little of this, a little of that, you know, like making some, what they call that soup, where you just throw everything you got that's in the cupboard into it and hope it cooks, right? That's, okay, we were told we're supposed to speak from a peer reviewer perspective. I tell you what, peer reviewers, and we do talk to each other sometimes, not about state specific, but sort of general. It's like, wow, you wouldn't believe what I got here. All this stuff, this evidence is just like all over the place. You got to look around, don't know exactly where to go. It's just a haphazard collection is all I can say. You're not doing anybody any favor if you do it that way. Even worse is if you've got missing details or entire aspects of your test security, kind of a comprehensive approach to test security. If that's just missing altogether, you know, again, look at the peer review guidance. There's lots of good examples there. Try to address them all. If you can't address certain things because they're kind of in process being formulated, then put together something a document that says you're working on it and here's the plans to meet this requirement. And then some evidence that this is related to what I just said, misses key procedures, that the key procedures were actually done. Because too many times it's like, oh yeah, we do this, we do that, but there's no real evidence that it actually was done. Monitoring has been a big challenge for states to show that they are actually indeed monitoring for test security and other aspects of a valid and reliable assessment program. So those are the three biggest that I can think of that are bad examples. It really does take some thought to organize ahead of time all the pieces and put them together, so kind of follow the peer review guide format, and then it makes the review process that much more straightforward.
I'm talking about element 2.6, systems for protecting data integrity and student privacy. When I entered assessment 30 plus years ago, it was a paper and pencil world. And I worked on national high stakes assessment, and we had to worry about things like the data or the test forms falling off the back of the truck. And we had to worry about things like students who took it on the East Coast didn't report the questions and their answers to their friends on the West Coast. So all of this played a part, and those were things we worried about. Then we moved into the computer-delivered assessment world. And although you'll see the same points are the points that receive the most stress and are the most open to problems of losing data or having data corrupted. They are the same points, but they happen in different ways. Okay. So now with computer delivery, you really have to worry about the site where it's delivered. Before you did with paper and pencil, the testing site. You had to make sure it was secure and all the students were sitting with their own little bubble sheet and their pens, their number 2 pencils, and they were coloring in their bubbles. Now you have to worry about, is that test monitor, the computer they're working on, is that secure? Is email open in it? Can they access other programs while they're testing? You have to know this, and you have to have that in your security plan. And your vendor can help you, because in some testing programs, what happens is when the testing program is accessed, it locks out anything else. So the student cannot access any other program like YouTube or email and have it working while they're testing. So you really have to know what's happening at that point and what are the security risks and how is that being handled? What are the prevention that is occurring? And then you have to document that. So you have to ask yourself all the way through the whole testing process, what are the risks? How is it being prevented? How is it being mitigated to as much extent as we can? And do we have it documented? And then not only documented, but are you communicating that to the field? Do they know what to do? In a testing situation, when a student is taking a test and the electricity goes off, what happens to that data? Is that data lost? Does the student have to retake the whole test? Or does the program, the testing site, save that data and the student can continue right where they left off before that occurred? But you have to know that. And these are questions you have to ask your vendor and be sure of the answers and know those answers and know what to do and then communicate to the field, what do you do when the power goes out? What are the steps you have to do? If a student gets sick in the middle of testing, if it's a paper and pencil test, you collect the paper and pencil test, you keep it safe, and the student can start again. But what do you do on a computer test? Can you pause the test? If you pause the test, will it wipe out all the students' data? Do you have to do something to save it? or will it automatically save? These are all things you have to know and have documented and understand what your vendor is supplying you and how it works. And then, of course, if there are things the field has to do, you have to communicate them. And then for evidence for peer review, you have to have documentation of exactly what happens, and then that you have documented the process and that you have communicated to all of your test administrators so everyone knows what to do when this happens. And all of that should be in your peer review submission. Then you have to think about, even at the vendor site, how is your data stored? How secure is that storage point? Is it behind firewalls? Is it encrypted? What's happening? Is the student identification data kept together with the score data, or are they in separate secure servers? In the server that it's kept, is that the only thing that's in the server, just the data, or are there other things in the server that might be used and corrupt or be open to cyber attack to your data? So you have to know what's going on. How is that data stored? It has to be documented. You have to know exactly what's happening at that point. And again, you have to be sure that your data, and especially the personal information about the student, is safe, is encrypted. I'm sorry, okay, is encrypted and cannot be broken into, okay, as much as we can. There are always new ways to break into. I mean, you know, it happens. Before we had cell phones. Now we have cell phones with cameras. And as John said, as soon as it happened, we had pictures on the web of test items. Probably in every state there was that used a computer delivered assessment at that point. I mean, every time there's something new. And now we hear about cyber attacks and automated cyber attacks. How are you protected? Document it. Understand how you're protected and put that in your peer review submission. All the points throughout an assessment have to be, I lost it, I don't know how far I am, have to be documented, and you have to, as part of peer review, and then you also have to make sure you communicate any decision-making processes to the field and include that in your peer review report. So I think you've heard that from all of us. Not only do you have to document it, but you have to document that the information was shared and that the information was listened to and understood. Sometimes some states require a little certification exam that testing administrators have to take before they actually administer the assessment. But you have to make sure also training goes further. At your vendor site, are the people handling the data trained? Are they trained on a yearly basis? Are there training programs to make sure they're aware of what's going on? If the data is encrypted, who has the key to the encryption? I mean, is it out there for anyone to use? Or is it with very few people? Okay. So everything, you have to look at all the parts and discover for yourselves, really, where the risk is in each section, and you work with your vendor to make sure you have everything documented, all the risk points and what happens when the data is transmitted to the test site and then back the items are transmitted to the test site and then back again, the data to the vendor. Is that submission secure? How does it happen? What is being used to transmit the data? Is it over the web? Is it a secure web transmission? Is it happening in the testing site? Is there a server there that's administering it? And is it safe? I mean, basically, if data is out there or items are out there at the testing site, the least amount of time possible in the testing site is the best thing to do. And they get back to the more secure server as soon as possible.
All right. Thank you, June. So for very, very detailed explanation of what you should be looking in terms of systems for protecting data security and integrity and privacy. So especially that the PPIs, right? That personal information for the students. You know, those are the kinds of things that hackers want to get at and all that. So that's very important. Has come to the front in the news and everything of how this information is really very important for that security to have it, encrypted and double encrypted, and where the encryption keys are and all those things. We have a couple of minutes extra, because the panels have been very, very good at keeping time. So I give like a little bit of time to float. So what I'm going to do is, I think it will be good is just to go backwards, and then we'll do John, and then we'll do Heather, and then you can maybe, like, I've seen you guys taking notes. Maybe it's something that came to mind here in the discussion that you would like to add to your points. Why don't we start with you, John, and then we go to Heather. And John, you have your microphone right there. Anything else you would like to add to what you said before?
We're not moving on to 4.7 yet?
Oh, well, I thought that you guys, well, yeah, you can talk to about 4.7, that would be perfect.
And then, okay.
Yeah.
Because I have something prepared for 4.7. Your other question, let me work on it fast here.
That's fine.
Although I covered a lot of things on test security. All right, so 4.7, which I think is, well, there's a lot of very important requirements in peer review, but technical analysis and ongoing maintenance. Now, if you work at a test publisher, testing vendor, you know that that's critically important because you've got a lot of investment in your test and it needs to be maintained and ongoing. State assessments should approach it with the same sort of philosophy, and there's a lot of specifics on types of evidence that you can provide, and this is one where the state and their vendor will have to work closely together to show documentation on things like validity, reliability, fairness. So let me just start by saying number one piece of evidence here is, of course, a technical report that should have all this information in there, and not necessarily just historical, but sometimes sort of the strategic plan on how you maintain your assessment into the current year and possibly into the future. And there's a lot of things on the technical criteria that can be used for maintaining the test, as well as analyses that can and should be done, such as looking at alignment, having validity studies done. Some of these, of course, fall into other topics in peer review, but it doesn't hurt to refer to them as you're providing evidence under 4.7. And I would just throw in some other things that I don't necessarily see in peer review examples, but looking at things like scale drift. How many states actually look on a routine basis at scale drift if they're using the same test for a number of years? And is the scale still the same as when you started it? Important thing to do. Looking at item exposure. Certainly in adaptive testing, that's critically important, but really paper and pencil and linear computer-based testing, that's important too, or at least they're looking at the parameters and saying, hey, how come this item is getting so much easier? I wonder if it's been pilfered, and it's out on Facebook right now. You never know. Actually, you should know. But anyway, evidence on should also be looking at subgroup performance, those types of things. Just a lot of things that can be looked at. And then last thing I would say is that this is where your TAC is very important. I mean, issues should be coming up, and the TAC should be providing guidance on and input that should be a document provided for peer review if you're doing things to look at your test and the quality of it, as well as maintaining it so that it is of high quality. So that's my piece on 4.7.
Thank you so much. And now I will need for you to pass the microphone for this side of the table. Thank you so much. And now, Heather,
Right.
Thanks, Mike.
speak on the phone.
Thank you. I just have two short things to add. And one of the things that came to me as I was listening to this and thinking about the different critical elements, and one is that balance of documentation and thoroughness versus easy accessibility. Because it's very easy to develop lots of documentation, all these large technical documents, and really possibly drown your stakeholders in documentation. Have a document that by its very length defends itself from ever being read by any of the users. But it could have hit every single point that the peer reviewers are looking for. And so I think that's really important to maintain and possibly have maybe dual purpose documents, one that is designed specifically for back-end documentation, but that all the documents that are that are shared with the users in the field, that those be kind of clear, concise, easy for them to access all of this information, because there's so much information that we deliver to people about testing and testing program. There's so much that testing coordinators need to know and remember. And then I think the second reflection I had was just about the peer review process itself in general. I know sometimes there are sometimes government requirements for things, and they can be seen more as just hoops to jump through. But what I found as both the reviewer and as a state participant in the process is that peer review, I think, has been really beneficial to the testing program of the state, because it really causes a team to reflect on, are you actually implementing best practices in your particular assessment? And I think it's been a really, really worthwhile process. So I've actually really enjoyed and engaging in this, which I think is maybe a little bit crazy given the amount of hours and hundreds and hundreds of documents that you have to pull together for something like this. But it really does cause it is the catalyst for your team to really come together and think about how are you addressing all of these different elements in your testing program.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. I do have two comments for you as a panel coordinator, and I've done several panels for several states. I have two comments for you, two tips, so to speak. One would be to organize your materials, because they're going to be, you're going to deliver it to the U.S. Department of Education in a digital form, and we have a system to do that. But make sure that those materials are organized by critical elements and be as detailed as possible in that organization. So if you're submitting materials that are evidence for 4.7, technical analysis and ongoing maintenance, to make sure that you identify exactly, and if you, like Heather mentioned, and I'm glad that Heather mentioned this because it's a perfect segue, if you are submitting materials that are doing double duty, make sure you specify what section of that guide or what section of that technical report applies to this particular critical element. Because sometimes, evidence is submitted and it's a huge guide, and then the peer reviewers don't know, what is it that you intended that the peer reviewers would see in that guide to be the evidence that satisfies the critical element. That's my first tip for you. Second tip is make sure you include page numbers. Because sometimes those guys, and they're laughing because I know it's true, right? I mean, it sounds correct page numbers. Sometimes, it sounds such a asinine thing, but it isn't, because when you submit a 300-page volume of of your guide, and there are multiple critical elements addressed in multiple sections, but you're submitting the same guide under each of the critical elements packages. We and they need to know what page numbers or number address the critical element. So, I mean, it sounds so, simple, but you will be amazed how many times we don't get the page numbers. So it's just a tip for you guys, to those of you who are going to submit, materials for evaluation, just to keep those things in mind. So that was my contribution to the discussion, and actually it's global. It's not just for these critical elements, for all the critical elements that you're going to be, listening presentations. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dedicate the rest of the time to address questions. If the panel feels that they can address it, they will. If they can't, again, I remind you that you have those cards inside your folder. We have some more cards. I put mine in there so you guys can use them. Write your questions, and we will make sure that they're moved up so we can address them in a proper way. Okay? So we just leave it open for question and answer.
Okay. I just have a general question, logistics-wise, that applies to, given the expertise of the panel and given the makeup.
One thing real quick. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I didn't mean to do that. When you come to ask a question, please identify yourself. Okay? So we will know who said that.
Brad Lenhart, I'm at the Oregon Department of Education.
Thank you.
And I oversee the Aldern assessment based on Aldern Achievement Standards. Been doing that for quite some time. But in light of the expertise of the panel and the numbers of new folks that raised their hands at our plenary session, I'm just wondering about some of the tools, resources, checklists, et cetera, that were alluded to or indicated in the presentations, if those would be available. If there would be a way to collect that, or at least a sample of those kinds of things, to put them in a spot where we could have, as a session, the group would have access to that. I know there's a lot out there, I get that, but I think it might be helpful for, again, some of those things. Heather, specifically an example, Heather mentioned some checklists prior to administration and just getting things ready, and the variety of different kinds of checklists for different roles in a district. Those things, again, might be helpful resources versus just sending us kind of hither and yon to find those things.
I think actually that's a really great idea, because that is one of the ways that that we've gotten materials as we kind of beg, borrow, and steal. And I've been scavenging through other people's websites to see what they've got and maybe what are some best practices, and talking to some colleagues. So yes, is there a way that maybe we could at the end of this have it maybe set up through a website or something where people could access some of the resources that we're willing to share?
All right. The Department of Education has a website where all the letters, the determination letters of the states, and that documentation cited. It resides, and also contains the critical elements for those letters that address what has been described on those letters. I would have to ask Dawn if there is an existing web page that could be used as a depository for checklists or things that are out there that have been developed by the peer reviewers. So that's definitely a great idea, and I will just I will put it through to Dawn and to Deborah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I understood from Don that they are putting together a place to post the PowerPoints and those kinds of things, that be the same state assessment peer review seminar site, that they would have that.
Yeah, that's the website that had the agenda and the registration forms and all that exist, and definitely that can become a depository for those kinds of things. So it's like an excellent idea, and I'll just make sure that I pass it on to Dawn and to Deborah. Other questions? Sorry, sir. I know we're tight, but it's just that then your question may or may not be recorded. You want to, maybe you want to use, mine is closer to you.
Thank you. Brian Ryder, Hawaii Department of Education. I noticed that a lot of states in the peer review notes received for curriculum element 2.6 a recommendation that the state define their policy or come up with a rationale behind the minimum maximum percentage reporting for the proficiency levels. Not really sure what is being required for that. Can you give us some examples of what might meet that requirement? For example, if 0% of the students were proficient on the assessment, or maybe 100% are non-proficient, what would be the requirement in order to meet that particular feedback?
Jen, would you like to address
I don't really know if I can.
it? Okay, well, I don't know. Any other panelists feel we can address that?
I think you raise a very interesting question, Brian, and I would be uncomfortable just pontificating on it. It's might be more of a Don question, or
So
Heather?
I can say I know in some of you might have in your ESSA submission, it might actually have some data suppression guidelines that might speak to that. And so I knew that was specifically what we had referred to in our submission was the data suppression guidelines from the ESSA submission.
Brian, if you could use your card to write that question, and I'll forward it to Don. And if you don't have any cards, they're right there. Or there's always a second way of solving it. Any other questions? You have this wonderful panel here, so please use their expertise and not only on the years of knowledge that they have here, but also as peer reviewers. Sorry about being a stickler like that.
This is Katia Fora from Delaware Department of Education. This is more of a question for all assessment and not targeted at regular year. When you were talking about the trouble shooting guides, can you explain a little bit more about, are you talking about help desk, FAQs, or any other documentation? Because
Thank you.
Thank you. So ideally, it would probably contain all of the above. So the help desk contact information would be a really important thing to have in there. But I was meaning troubleshooting guides more in the sense of if you're doing, let's say, computer-based testing and you encounter this specific challenge, like the one that I referenced in the example where connectivity is lost while the student is testing and you see the indicator connectivity is lost. Maybe what are the appropriate steps to take in this situation? And there are, because at least for the vendor that Tennessee uses, there are some specific triggers that then have to occur once that happens.
yeah, I just wanted to kind of put it out there for everybody.
okay.
Just to see if everybody was on the same page or not.
Thank you so much.
Jesse Marco, currently consulting with ELPA 21. So these elements are elements that require, at least on your schematic, you're looking at them requiring coordination or joint submission by a consortium office as well as states. Any recommendations or thoughts about the best ways or best practices once they come to you to make that happen?
Any of you?
I haven't reviewed any of the consortium submissions,
Yeah.
so.
Jesse, I just want to address real quick that on the guide that you received this morning, and that has been available for quite some time, on page 21, it actually spells out which critical element may be state-specific. Right. Some of them are state-specific, some of them are coordinated evidence, and some of them are hybrid evidence. So that's where your question.
These are the hybrid.
Right.
And so I'm asking from you the advice on how you would see that presented in the most helpful way.
I'll give it a
Sure.
shot. So I had another comment I wanted to make, and I can work it right into this response here. Because first of all, we did a quick check with each other, the peers. None of us have reviewed any consortium submissions or even a hybrid one. When I've done reviews, it's been basically state stuff. If there's a consortium involved, all we've been told is, well, that's already been taken care of by the other review panel that looked at all of that. What I would think, though, is a lot of the same principles we've been talking about apply. It needs to be very well organized, the materials put together. Hopefully the state, especially on these hybrid type things, have had, or I should say states, since it's a bunch, either, I'm sure you're thinking ELPA 21 or maybe that other ELP assessment group, starts with a W. But anyway, that it has been reviewed by the member states too, so that all this information is definitely understood. In fact, in another panel that I'm on, this was emphasized a lot, that the state cannot just take materials from a vendor or a consortium. They have to look at it and understand it and have their buy-in in it before it's submitted to peer reviewers. So I don't know what's being done in the department office, but, and let me just say one other thing, and maybe you have a follow-up question. It's very critical, be it a consortium, a hybrid, individual state, when they put the materials together, they use that the Fed's index template that's part of the peer review submission, and use it wisely, organize your things there, because from a peer reviewer standpoint, that thing is critically important. We start wading through, you know, anywhere from 100 to 500 pieces of documentation, some documents 500 pages long, you know, do the math, and it's a lot to look at, and if it is disorganized, it's disorienting. If you can't find the right page number or something, you're hunting around, your brain starts exploding. It's not an easy task to be a peer reviewer because you really have to look at a lot of things. So that template and those materials in there, along with some documentation or notes in there that say, okay, here's the intent of this piece of evidence and why it's included. So please use it.
So it might say, see consortium evidence,
Uh-huh.
and that's it. And that's all you would see as a peer reviewer, and you would move on.
Yeah, we're told we're not supposed to re-review the
Correct.
Right.
I can,
So,
One
What-
thing,
what
I
about
just
you?
want to say that it has to be clearly delineated, what is the consortium evidence and what is the state-specific or what is the hybrid or whatever it is. So the peer reviewers know, don't leave it to guess.
yeah, one more thing, Jesse, it's that typically even if you're doing a hybrid submission, if you look at the critical elements, typically there's not that much overlapping on what is the state versus what is the consortium's responsibilities. If you look at that chart, you will see that. Also, if there are any questions, I encourage you to contact Dawn or Deborah because they can sort it out. They have looked at other consortia and or other entities that submit, assessments to the state in behalf of, to the United States Department of Education on behalf of the states. So this is not the first time that they do it, so they can give you very concrete recommendations as a consortia. But operationally, that's what happens. If there are peer reviewers looking at the state blank, and that state is a hybrid in which they have, an ELP assessment with your organization, and you have worked together for them to use your assessment, they will be reviewing only the pieces of the critical elements pertaining to the responsibility of the state, and a separate review will occur that is, for the consortia instrument. So it will be separate.
I understand all that.
Okay.
I was just looking for what you want at the state level. And when you come to a hybrid and that piece of evidence, the state says, well, the consortium did that.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
That's all they need to say.
Right. That's all. They will not address those critical elements. They only address the elements that pertain to whether they're reviewing the consortia instrument, only with those, and then if it's a state, the state. And that makes help. And again, I encourage you again for you to reach out to Don or Deborah if you have very specific questions about specific elements.